The palace thought it was routine. A quiet financial audit. A procedural review. But buried inside a stack of sealed documents was something no one anticipated: a string of payments linked directly to Queen Camilla. Not charitable donations. Not official royal expenses. Private transfers. Repeated. Substantial. And addressed to one mysterious individual. Within hours, King Charles was informed, and what happened next would shake the monarchy from the inside out. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, no one panicked. Royal finances are complex, layered with trusts, estates, and private allowances that blur the line between personal and institutional wealth. But this was different. The audit team had flagged the transfers not because of their size alone, but because of their pattern. Month after month, the same destination, the same discreet labeling. Consulting, a word so ordinary it felt deliberate. Safe, designed not to attract attention. And yet, here it was, attracting exactly the kind of attention the palace fears most. Senior accountants had quietly circled the entries, cross-checking authorizations. The approvals were legitimate, the signatures valid. The funds released through proper channels. That was what made it worse. There was no hacking, no forgery. These payments had been sanctioned privately, bypassing the usual layers of royal transparency. When the report reached the king's desk, it was accompanied by a single cautious note: further clarification required. That phrase alone carried weight. In palace language, it meant trouble. King Charles did not react publicly. He never does. But those closest to him noticed the shift. The measured calm, the tightening of his jaw as he turned the pages himself, refusing a summary. He wanted the raw data, the unfiltered truth. And when he saw that the authorizations traced directly back to Camilla's private office, something unspoken passed across his face. This was not an external threat. It was internal. Personal. The recipient's name was initially redacted in the circulated copy, masked under protocol until clearance was granted. Yet within palace corridors, whispers travel faster than official memos. A handful of senior aides already knew. They understood the sensitivity. They understood the history. And they understood that if the press ever caught even a fragment of this story, it would not be framed as routine financial discretion. It would be framed as secrecy. By late afternoon, Clarence House felt different. Conversations lowered to near silence when doors opened. Staff exchanged careful glances. No one dared speculate openly, but the tension was unmistakable. The king had requested the complete file. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Immediately. And in royal timing, immediacy signals urgency. For now, the decision was containment. No statements. No leaks. No public acknowledgement. The matter would remain internal until clarity was achieved. But clarity has a way of demanding confrontation. And confrontation was inevitable. Because this was not merely about money. It was about trust, authority, control. But what truly rattled the king wasn't just the money, it was who the money was going to. When the redacted name was finally revealed to King Charles, the room reportedly fell silent. This wasn't a distant acquaintance. This wasn't a forgotten relative. This was someone from Camilla's past, someone whose connection to the royal family had long been considered complicated. The payments weren't random. They were deliberate. And if the public ever discovered the identity behind those transfers, it could ignite a scandal unlike any the monarchy has faced in decades. The name alone carried history. Not the kind printed in official biographies, but the kind whispered about in drawing rooms and buried beneath decades of carefully managed headlines. This individual had once occupied a quiet but influential space within Camilla's inner circle, long before crowns and coronations reshaped the landscape of her life. Back then, loyalty meant privacy, discretion meant survival, and certain alliances were formed not for power, but for protection. For Charles, the revelation struck deeper than any financial irregularity. He had believed that particular chapter had closed years ago. Distanced, managed, strategically removed from public view for the sake of unity. The monarchy survives on perception, and perception requires control. This person had been deliberately pushed into the background to prevent precisely this kind of narrative from resurfacing. And yet here it was not through rumor, not through scandal sheets, but through cold, undeniable numbers on an official ledger. What troubled him most was the timeline. These payments were not relics of a distant past. They were recent, structured, ongoing. That detail changed the emotional equation entirely. This was not nostalgia. It was continuity. A connection maintained in silence. And as Charles scanned the dates, cross-referencing public engagements and private milestones, an unsettling question surfaced. Had this relationship ever truly ended, or had it simply evolved into something quieter, more strategic? Advisors did not need to exaggerate the danger. The potential fallout was obvious. If the press linked the financial transfers to a figure already associated with past tension, the story would not remain about consulting fees. It would become about divided loyalties, about hidden allegiances, about whether the Queen's private decisions undermined the King's authority. And in an era where public trust in institutions hangs by a fragile thread, perception can be more destructive than proof. For Charles, the emotional weight was harder to contain than the political implications. He had fought for years to stabilize the monarchy's image, to transition from controversy to continuity. Now he was forced to confront the possibility that a vulnerability had been sitting within his own household. The sense of betrayal was not explosive. It was quiet, measured, the kind that settles in the chest and refuses to move. He did not raise his voice. He did not summon aides in anger. Instead, he asked for confirmation. Had he been informed of any continued association? The answer was cautious, incomplete, carefully phrased. Inside the palace, tension thickened. Senior staff sensed the shift. Not chaos, something more controlled, more deliberate. A reckoning was forming, not in public, but in private. Because this was no longer about speculation. It was about explanation. And explanations require confrontation. And so, behind closed doors, the king requested a private audience with his queen. No cameras, no aides, no staff. Just King Charles and Queen Camilla and a file of bank statements laid between them. According to insiders, the air inside Clarence House was thick with tension as Charles asked one simple question. Why? What followed wasn't just a financial discussion. It was personal. Painfully personal. Because these payments carried implications that went far beyond money. Charles did not begin with accusation. He began with precision. Page by page, he laid out the transfers, the dates, the authorizations bearing her office's approval. His voice, those familiar with it say, was controlled, almost restrained. But beneath that restraint was something sharper: disappointment edged with disbelief. He was not asking whether the payments existed. That was no longer in question. He was asking why they had been hidden from him. Why the discretion? Why the silence? Camilla at first resisted the framing. She described the concern as exaggerated, the interpretation as flawed. Misunderstood, she reportedly insisted, suggesting that the payments had been mischaracterized by overzealous auditors. In her view, this was administrative, not emotional, necessary, not secretive. But Charles did not retreat. He pressed further, not about the sums, but about the secrecy. Why had he learned of this through a financial review instead of through his own wife? The conversation began to shift. This was no longer about consulting labels or ledger entries. It was about trust, and trust, in their shared history, had already been tested. Years of public scrutiny, private sacrifices, and relentless media narratives had forced them to build a partnership on resilience. They had survived scandal before. They had survived criticism, doubt, even open hostility. But this felt different. This felt internal. Charles reportedly referenced the long journey they had taken to secure stability for the monarchy. He spoke of legacy, of public confidence, of the fragile balance he had worked to maintain since ascending the throne. The payments, he argued, were not isolated transactions. They carried symbolic weight. If exposed, they would not be dissected as financial decisions, but as evidence of divided loyalty. And perception, he knew too well, can fracture even the strongest institution. Camilla did not apologize. Not immediately. Instead, she defended her reasoning with firmness that surprised even those who know her resolve. She described the arrangement as protective, as something designed to prevent a far greater crisis from unfolding. According to insiders, she believed she had acted in the monarchy's long-term interest, quietly resolving a vulnerability before it could erupt publicly. In her mind, discretion was strength. But Charles heard something else in that defense. He heard independence. Autonomy, a decision made without shared counsel, and that struck at the heart of royal unity. A monarchy divided in private cannot project strength in public. He questioned whether unilateral choices, however well-intentioned, had placed the institution at risk. The implication hung heavy between them. Had personal loyalty overridden collective responsibility? What made the exchange so volatile was not shouting or visible fury. It was the emotional undercurrent, the reminder of past fractures, the silent acknowledgement that history has a way of repeating itself when lessons are left unfinished. Both understood the stakes. Both understood that the issue had grown beyond a private disagreement. The meeting ended without resolution. No formal decision. No dramatic ultimatum. Just a lingering tension that refused to dissipate. And as the door closed on that private exchange, it became clear that this confrontation had only exposed the first layer of a much deeper problem. But the financial transfers were only the surface. Deeper questions were beginning to emerge. As forensic accountants revisited months of financial data, a troubling pattern appeared. The payments were not sporadic. They were structured, timed, calculated, and they coincided with several sensitive royal events. Was it coincidence or coordination? The more the palace reviewed the timeline, the clearer it became. This wasn't a single lapse in judgment. It was a sustained arrangement. And that realization changed everything. What began as a private marital confrontation now widened into something colder, more analytical, and far more dangerous. The dates were laid out against the royal calendar: state visits, high-profile announcements, delicate family negotiations, moments when public scrutiny was already intense. And there, threaded through those milestones, were the transfers. Not always on the same day, not always in identical amounts, but close enough to raise suspicion, close enough to invite a darker interpretation. The accountants stopped treating the payments as isolated entries. They began treating them as signals. Structured intervals suggested intention. Consistency suggested agreement. The language of finance can be sterile, but beneath the spreadsheets lurked an unsettling possibility. Were these funds simply financial support, or were they linked to something exchanged in return? Information? Silence? Influence? No one could yet prove such a connection, but the timing fueled the speculation. Advisors gathered quietly, weighing scenarios that only weeks earlier would have sounded absurd. Could this evolve into a constitutional matter? If a private financial relationship influenced royal decision-making, even indirectly, it could undermine the integrity of the crown. That word integrity began appearing in internal briefings. Not publicly, not yet. But internally it was spoken with gravity. The fear was not just scandal, it was vulnerability. The monarchy survives because it appears united, controlled, above manipulation. The suggestion that an external figure, someone deliberately distanced from public life, might hold any degree of leverage was intolerable. Even the perception of influence could erode decades of careful image rebuilding. And in a modern era where transparency is demanded and secrets are hunted, perception becomes power. Camilla's response during this deeper review was notable for what it lacked. She did not elaborate. She did not expand on her earlier defense. Her silence grew firmer, almost protective. To some within the palace, it signaled resolve. To others, it signaled containment, as though there were layers still undisclosed. The less she said, the more questions multiplied. Meanwhile, Charles sought counsel beyond emotional confrontation. A trusted legal confidant was consulted discreetly. Not to accuse, but to assess risk. Could these payments violate protocol? Did they breach any formal obligations tied to royal funding structures? Technically, perhaps not. Symbolically, however, the matter was far murkier. Royal protocol thrives on transparency within its inner circle. Secrecy, even if lawful, can corrode trust. Within the palace staff, quiet fractures began to form. Some defended Camilla's autonomy, arguing that private discretion had always existed within royal households. Others aligned more closely with the king's concern, viewing the arrangement as dangerously unilateral. Loyalty, once assumed, now felt divided along subtle lines. And while the palace scrambled to contain the situation, another unsettling detail came to light. What stunned King Charles most wasn't the money, it was the document discovered alongside the transfers. A private memorandum. Signed, dated, and seemingly negotiated without his awareness. If authentic, it suggested an understanding between Camilla and the mysterious recipient that predated Charles's reign. And that revelation didn't just threaten trust. It threatened the very foundation of the monarchy's internal unity. The memorandum was not lengthy, but it was precise. Its language was careful, almost clinical, outlining terms that appeared to formalize an arrangement long suspected but never confirmed. It referenced discretion, mutual protection, continued support under changing circumstances. There were no emotional flourishes, no dramatic admissions, just structured commitments framed as safeguards. Yet for Charles, the absence of emotion was exactly what made it devastating. It read like strategy. It read like foresight. It read like something designed to endure. The date was what cut deepest. It preceded his accession. It preceded the reshaping of the royal hierarchy that came with the crown. In other words, this agreement had been crafted at a time when futures were still uncertain, when alliances were shifting, and when the public narrative surrounding Camilla remained fragile. The implication was clear. She had anticipated risk. She had built a private contingency, and she had done so without his knowledge. For a monarch whose authority rests not only on ceremony but on unity, this felt like a parallel power structure. Charles reportedly revisited the timeline again and again, tracing moments when transparency might have altered his understanding. Had he overlooked signals? Had trust been assumed where caution was required? The questions did not explode outward. They turned inward. Camilla's explanation, when pressed, did not deny the document. Instead, she reframed it. According to those familiar with the exchange, she insisted it was an act of protection, not betrayal. She believed certain vulnerabilities from her past had the potential to resurface at the worst possible moment. The memorandum, she argued, ensured stability. It neutralized threats quietly, without burdening the crown with another public ordeal. In her eyes, she had shielded the institution. But intention does not erase impact. Advisors began debating the legal standing of the memorandum. Was it binding? Could it be dissolved? If challenged, would doing so provoke exactly the exposure it was meant to prevent? The more they analyzed it, the clearer it became that the issue was not merely contractual. It was symbolic. A queen operating under a private framework unknown to her king undermined the very image of shared governance that the monarchy projects. Inside the marriage, the emotional strain deepened. Secrecy within any partnership breeds distance. Within a royal marriage, it breeds instability. Charles now faced a painful duality: defend the woman he had fought decades to stand beside, or confront the reality that she had built a safeguard without him. That realization did not come with shouting. It came with silence heavy enough to reshape a relationship. Beyond the immediate circle, another concern emerged: how would this appear to Prince William? The heir's loyalty to institutional integrity is unwavering. If he perceived divided authority or concealed arrangements, it could fracture more than trust between husband and wife. It could create a generational rift, one that echoes into the future reign. And within palace corridors, that fear began to crystallize. This was no longer a private matter. It was becoming a dynastic one. But the ripple effects of this confrontation were already extending beyond the king and queen. When Prince William was quietly briefed, insiders say his reaction was swift and far from neutral. As heir to the throne, William's concern wasn't just about family tension. It was about stability, public trust, the future of the crown. Because if this story reached the press unchecked, it could reopen old wounds the monarchy has fought desperately to heal. And William reportedly made one thing clear: this could not spiral. The briefing was discreet, delivered with measured language and carefully chosen pauses, yet the substance was impossible to soften. Financial transfers. A private memorandum. A name from the past resurfacing at the worst possible moment. William listened without interruption, but those present sensed the shift in him almost immediately. His questions were not emotional. They were strategic. How extensive was the arrangement? Who else knew? What safeguards were in place if exposure became inevitable? Unlike Charles, whose reaction carried the weight of personal betrayal, William's focus sharpened around institutional survival. He had grown up watching how quickly public opinion can harden. He understood how narratives take root and refuse to die. The monarchy, in his view, was not simply a family legacy, it was a fragile contract with the public. And contracts fracture under secrecy. Subtle tension, long dormant, began to resurface between William and Camilla's camp. The past had required careful diplomacy to maintain outward unity. Now, whispers suggested that old hesitations had never fully disappeared. Trust, once managed through proximity and shared duty, felt suddenly conditional. William reportedly requested full transparency, not summaries, not interpretations, but the unfiltered reality. If he was to inherit the institution one day, he needed clarity today. His greatest fear was not immediate scandal, but reputational erosion. The monarchy had spent years rebuilding its image as modern, accountable, responsive. A hidden financial arrangement tied to a controversial figure threatened to undo that work. William understood something crucial. The public forgives mistakes more readily than it forgives concealment. If this appeared as calculated secrecy, the backlash would not be fleeting. Behind closed doors, father and son spoke candidly. No aides, no formal scripts. Just two men bound by blood and burden. Charles shared his emotional turmoil, the sting of discovering a memorandum he had never authorized. William listened, but he also steered the conversation toward containment. Damage control, messaging strategy, legal review. Their exchange was not confrontational. It was aligned cautiously, but unmistakably aligned. Concerns about leaks intensified. Palace staff, already uneasy, could become sources if divisions widened. William reportedly emphasized internal discipline. Silence must hold. Loyalty must be reinforced. Because once the story escaped, control would vanish. Succession politics, usually unspoken, quietly influenced the atmosphere. The heir could not appear disconnected from the crisis, nor could he appear complicit. In that delicate balance, a silent understanding formed between Charles and William. Whatever personal hurt existed between king and queen, the institution had to come first. That shared priority created an unexpected bond in the midst of turmoil. It was not triumph, it was necessity. And as strategies were being drafted behind palace walls, the outside world began sensing that something was wrong. It started with a rumor. A financial anomaly mentioned in a discreet column. Then a cryptic headline hinting at royal discrepancies. Within days, reporters were circling. The palace had not made an announcement, but the silence itself was becoming suspicious. Because when the monarchy refuses to comment, the speculation multiplies. And speculation, in the modern media age, spreads faster than any official denial. At first, it was subtle, a single paragraph buried beneath larger political stories. An unnamed source referencing unusual internal transfers. The language was careful, almost teasing. But for those who follow royal affairs closely, it was enough. Enough to trigger questions. Enough to alert editors who had long memories and sharper instincts. The palace may have believed the issue was contained within its walls, yet information has a way of slipping through cracks no one notices until it is too late. Soon, the whispers gained shape. Anonymous insiders hinted at financial irregularities without naming names. The lack of clarity became fuel. Media outlets began revisiting Camilla's past associations, drawing faint but deliberate connections between old controversies and new uncertainties. What had once been private history was repackaged as unresolved tension. Headlines stopped asking if something was wrong. They began asking how serious it might be. Online, the reaction was immediate and relentless. Social media did what it always does, it filled in the blanks. Theories multiplied by the hour. Some were exaggerated, others outright false, but all shared one dangerous trait: momentum. Screenshots circulated. Archived interviews resurfaced. The narrative grew legs of its own, sprinting ahead of facts. And every minute the palace remained silent, the void expanded. Inside the communications office, urgency replaced routine. Draft statements were prepared and rewritten. Lawyers reviewed language. Advisors debated tone, defensive or transparent, brief or comprehensive. The goal was control, but control felt increasingly fragile. Charles, according to those close to him, urged caution. He understood the danger of reacting too quickly, of validating rumors by acknowledging them prematurely. Yet restraint carries risk when public imagination has already ignited. Camilla's absence from scheduled appearances did not go unnoticed. Official explanations cited prior commitments and adjustments to her calendar, but the timing intensified suspicion. Commentators interpreted retreat as confirmation. The optics were unforgiving. In an age where visibility equals stability, absence becomes a statement. Meanwhile, a broader narrative began forming not just about payments or memorandums, but about power. Was the monarchy fractured behind closed doors? Was the king losing control of his inner circle? These questions, speculative as they were, struck at the heart of public confidence. The institution thrives on the image of unity. Once that image cracks, every action is scrutinized through the lens of doubt. Pressure mounted from multiple directions. Political figures avoided direct commentary, but emphasized the importance of transparency in public institutions. Royal correspondents demanded clarification. Even loyal supporters began expressing quiet concern. The story was no longer confined to gossip columns. It was edging toward mainstream discourse. Within palace walls, the realization settled heavily. Silence could no longer be a long-term strategy. The issue had outgrown containment. It was evolving into a defining moment, one that would test not only relationships but leadership itself. And now, with the monarchy at a crossroads, a decision must be made. King Charles now faces a choice that could define his reign: protect his queen at all costs, or confront the issue publicly to safeguard the institution. The confrontation behind closed doors was only the beginning. Because this moment isn't just about bank records or private payments. It's about trust, authority, legacy, and whether the monarchy can survive yet another internal storm without losing the public's faith. For Charles, the weight of the crown has never felt heavier. As a husband, loyalty pulls him toward defense, toward shielding the woman who stood beside him through decades of scrutiny and eventual triumph. As king, responsibility pulls in the opposite direction toward transparency, toward preservation of the institution that will outlive them both. These two forces now collide in a quiet but relentless battle within him. This is not a decision about money. It is a decision about identity. Advisors remain divided. Some argue that issuing a carefully structured clarification could control the narrative before it hardens into scandal. Others warn that any admission, however minor, risks validating speculation that might otherwise fade. The room where these debates unfold is tense not because voices are raised, but because the stakes are unmistakable. Every word drafted carries consequence. Every silence carries danger. Camilla, according to those closest to her, refuses to frame her actions as wrongdoing. She stands firm in her reasoning, convinced that discretion was an act of protection, not deception. In her view, yielding now would imply guilt where none exists. That resolve complicates the king's dilemma. To publicly distance himself from her decisions would fracture their unity. To defend them fully might expose him to accusations of complicity. William's counsel is measured but clear. Transparency, he believes, must be strategic but inevitable. The next generation of leadership cannot inherit shadows. His concern is not emotional but pragmatic. Once comparisons to past royal scandals begin circulating, they gain power of their own. History becomes a weapon in public discourse. The monarchy has survived crises before, but survival always comes at a cost. And that cost is hovering over the present moment. Approval ratings are fragile. Public patience is thinner than it once was. In an era defined by scrutiny, the crown's authority rests less on tradition and more on perceived integrity. Charles understands this deeply. He has spent years reshaping his image, stepping into a role once defined by controversy and attempting to transform it into continuity. Now he risks being pulled backward by a narrative he did not anticipate. The emotional toll is undeniable. Behind the composed exterior of a reigning monarch is a man confronting the possibility that private decisions may redefine his public legacy. He cannot undo the memorandum. He cannot erase the transfers. He can only choose how to respond. And that choice will echo far beyond palace walls. There is no guaranteed outcome. Even the most calculated strategy cannot fully control perception. The story has already escaped into public imagination. What remains uncertain is whether decisive leadership will stabilize the institution or whether hesitation will amplify doubt. The monarchy stands at a precarious intersection between protection and exposure, unity and fracture. Because in the House of Windsor, secrets rarely stay buried, and this confrontation may only be the beginning of a far greater reckoning. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.